Well, good morning, folks. I'm excited to be here with Transportation Minister Ric McIver for an important job-creating announcement about Alberta's economic recovery to create thousands of jobs and get people back to work in our province when it's so desperately needed. Of course, through the pandemic, Alberta has been struggling with a triple whammy. First of all, the biggest public health crisis in over a century, which required a lot of damage, imposed, I should say, a lot of damage on our economy all across the province. Secondly, we are, like the rest of the world, dealing with a global coronavirus recession. And thirdly, the impact of the collapse in energy prices, which has hammered our largest industry, of course, our energy sector. And all of that is on top of 5 tough years. But Albertans have performed with great resilience and responsibility throughout the pandemic. Alberta had the least stringent public health restrictions of any Canadian province, and amongst the most limited restrictions in the entire Western world. In fact, 85% of our businesses were able to continue to operate within new health guidelines, representing 88% of Alberta's workforce and 96% of our province's GDP. We've also reopened those sectors of the economy, those businesses that had been suspended, more quickly and more broadly than I believe any other Canadian province. And some of the data coming in now supports that. Data out from Statistics Canada today confirming that Alberta saw a much smaller contraction, for example, in the retail sector than the other large Canadian provinces. Earlier this week, I was speaking to the president of one of the major chartered banks who said that their credit card data supports that declines in billings in Alberta were much lower through the pandemic than in other major Canadian provinces. So this is a confirmation that perhaps we haven't been hit as hard as we initially expected. Nevertheless, we are facing a real economic trough, of course, with 15% official unemployment. And if you look at it in terms of the number of people who left the job force altogether, a real effective unemployment rate of 25%. Add on top of that the continued adversity in the energy sector because of the global recession, and which is very likely to last in that sector for 12 to 18 months, and we have a huge challenge in front of us. That is why Alberta's government has acted with speed and a real ambition to protect our economy, to protect livelihoods, and to protect job creators. We've done so by already delivering some $14 billion of fiscal action through direct support to individuals and families, to small businesses, to job creation programs, to our healthcare system, and also through deferrals, through tax reductions, and so much more. This includes the recently announced Small Business Restart Grant for those businesses who had to suspend their operations because of public health measures. It also includes, of course, our $1.5 billion job-creating investment in getting the Keystone XL pipeline built, which is well underway, creating 7,400 good-paying jobs here north of the Canada-U.S. border. It also involves the thousands of jobs being created right now through the $1 billion well reclamation program. And I understand that so far all signs are very positive about the response to that program. It also involves an additional $1 billion in job-creating infrastructure spending through capital maintenance and repair work that our government announced this year. And that's on top of the $6.9 billion infrastructure budget that was already embedded in Budget 2020 as part of our blueprint for jobs and growth. But there's much more that needs to be done. And today I'm here with Minister McIver to announce an additional step. I'm very pleased to announce today a further $200 million in funding for local transportation infrastructure and waterworks projects in Alberta that will get thousands of people back to work. This includes an additional $50 million for the Strategic Infrastructure Investment Program on top of the $60 million already allocated for this program STIP in this year's budget. This doubling of STIP grants will enable small and rural municipalities across the province to maintain and improve local roads and bridges, community airports, and other local priorities, and is expected to create nearly 500 jobs. It will help these communities develop and maintain the essential local transportation infrastructure on which future investment, economic growth, and prosperity will be built. In addition to creating jobs through 69 new local transportation infrastructure projects, we're also investing $150 million on top of that in new funding into the most basic and important local infrastructure of all, and that is our public water works that provide safe, clean drinking water for our homes and businesses and return safe, clean, treated wastewater to our environment. This funding, which will be delivered through the Alberta Municipal Wastewater Partnership, as well as the Alberta First Nations Water Tie-In Program, will help further stimulate our economy and create about 1,300 much-needed jobs in communities across Alberta. Coming on top of the $243 million allocated for water projects already in this year's budget, this additional investment will fund 54 municipal waterworks projects, plus a tie-in that will deliver clean drinking water from a regional pipeline in Ponoka to the Erminskeen First Nation in central Alberta. Minister McIver will provide more details, but I'll just conclude by saying that the job-creating investments that we are announcing today will create hundreds of jobs and stimulate economic activity right away. I mean, like immediately, this upcoming week, projects begin, and also pay economic and quality of life dividends long into the future for dozens of local Alberta communities. So with that, I'm happy to invite Minister McIver to say a few words.
Thank you, Premier. It's, as Premier Kenney stated, it's been a challenging year, but we're relaunching Alberta's economy, and we've made several announcements over the past few months highlighting the ways in which our government is supporting Albertans during this time. In early April, of course, we announced $410 million in additional funding for provincial highway maintenance and renewal to fix our roads, bridges, fill potholes, repaint lines, and seal cracks. And today, I'm very pleased to share some details on $200 million in additional grant funding. The significant investment will help further stimulate our economy and, most importantly, as the Premier has outlined, support an estimated 1,800 more much-needed jobs in communities right across Alberta. Of this $200 million, $50 million will go to municipalities through the Strategic Transportation Infrastructure Program, which supports upgrades for local bridges, roads, and community airports. And $150 million will go to the Alberta Municipal Water and Wastewater Partnership and First Nations Water Tie-In, which supports upgrades for water infrastructure. These programs are popular with municipalities and are already in place, meaning that we can get the money out the door faster and support projects municipalities need and have already asked for, because some of the due diligence was done even before COVID. We know that these are smart investments because municipalities themselves have looked at their priority lists and told us what projects are most critical to each of their communities. If you want that small manufacturing business to establish its home base in your town, you need good local roads and bridges for the transport trucks to ship and pick up materials. If you need wastewater capacity and water treatment capacity, not only for current residents, but for the new residents that will move to those municipalities as new economic development unfolds. The link between strong infrastructure and investment is clear. You can't have one without the other. Local roads and bridges, resource roads, community airports, and water and wastewater treatment are vital to Alberta's rural communities. On STIP, through this additional $50 million in grants, we can maintain and improve this infrastructure. STIP helps increase the capacity of municipal transportation infrastructure to support economic growth in those important rural communities. And strong local economies inevitably contribute to Alberta's overall economic strength. These projects will support approximately 480 jobs in communities across Alberta. Now, on the water grant side, we're investing $150 million to support over 50 water infrastructure projects through the Alberta Municipal Water Wastewater Partnership program and the First Nations Water Tie-In program. Again, this program is popular. It's oversubscribed by municipalities, which means, again, we've done the due diligence, some of it before COVID-19, which means we can act now and get that construction started as soon as possible. This funding will ensure that Albertans, including First Nations communities, have access to clean drinking water and improved wastewater facilities. The grants will be used to improve water supply and treatment facilities and make water upgrades to including lagoons, berms, and sewage treatment enhancements. And through the First Nations Water Tie-In program, some of our First Nations partners can complete the necessary upgrades to connect to new and existing regional water systems and provide clean water systems, again, for their current citizens and those that come as the economy expands. The $150 million in water grant funding is estimated to support over 300 jobs more. The Premier's correct when he talks about the resilience of Albertans. We're a tough bunch here in Alberta, and we'll get through this together. I'm proud to be a small part of today's announcement of investments that will improve local infrastructure, keep people working, and build on our local and provincial economies. Thank you.
Okay, we'll now take questions. Operator, can you please put through the first caller?
First is Amanda Stevenson with the Calgary Herald. Go ahead, Amanda.
Hi, my question is for the Premier. This week we heard news of layoffs and buyouts at Ovintiv and Enbridge, and we're also hearing of smaller scale layoffs at other oil and gas companies. I just wanted to get your reaction to that and whether you expect that we will see more significant layoffs in the energy sector through Q2.
Well, obviously, our heart goes out to those who have been laid off and those and other companies. This is frankly not surprising, I think, for anyone, given that this is the greatest economic contraction since the Great Depression, and it has hit our largest industry, oil and gas, especially hard. And so this is something that I think we've all seen coming. During the global pandemic and the coronavirus recession, we saw global demand for oil collapse by about 25%. And at the same time, we saw the irresponsible actions of the Saudis, Russians, and other OPEC plus countries who surged additional supply in the face of a demand collapse. This resulted, of course, in the biggest decline in oil prices, I believe, in history, to the point where a few weeks ago we were selling Alberta energy at negative prices, below zero. That is the tough news that we're all familiar with. But I believe there is a silver lining here that's starting to become evident, that prices have come back to at least a more or less what I would characterize as a survival price point now, with WTI in the high 30s and WCS in the low 30s over most of the past couple of weeks. These are essentially prices that will allow the vast majority of producers, I believe, to get through this tough time. And there are a growing number of projections that because of the shut-in of production, particularly new exploration activity around the world, a lot of that in the United States shale basin, the Permian Basin, for example, that a lot of those shut-ins and a lot of that canceled exploration activity means that when demand fully recovers, which we would expect to see over the course of the next year, that there will likely be the beginning of a scarcity of supply. Now, the problem is that global inventories reached near tank tops in April because of the supply and demand factors, and it'll take a while for those inventories to drain down. But in the midterm, we can certainly see a path towards a significant recovery in prices where these good Canadian companies can return profits and reinvest in and hire people back. So in the meantime, this government will be doing everything we possibly can to protect jobs and to soften the blow for those who are being affected. This is, for example, one of the reasons we went forward with our $1.5 billion preferred equity investment in the Keystone XL pipeline, to get thousands of people working in the service sector on that project, as they are right now, throughout Alberta, and B, to demonstrate in the long run that there is a reason to invest in the Alberta oil and gas sector for future projects, because there will be that market access represented by KXL and hopefully Trans Mountain as well. So this is a tough day for those in those companies who are affected. I suspect they're not entirely surprised. I do understand that at Enbridge that these were voluntary buyouts. And let me just say, there's a long history in Alberta of people taking buyouts from oil and gas companies during downturns who go and start their own businesses and rebound, and that's the creative entrepreneurial culture of our province.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Next is Sammy Hudez with Post Media. Go ahead, Sammy.
Hi there, Premier Kenney. Thanks for taking my question. Today, Alberta Health Services had planned to launch a phone-based supervised consumption program allowing drug users to be monitored over the phone should they need assistance. At the 11th hour yesterday, your government halted this program. You've previously spoken about the socioeconomic problems that come with brick-and-mortar supervised consumption sites, but this program wouldn't have disrupted any nearby businesses. It wouldn't have led to any increased crime. It simply would have helped save lives, according to AHS. So why would your government stop this program? And why would it wait until the day before it's supposed to launch to do so?
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not aware of the program, Sammy. I will refer questions on this to, I guess, Jason Lewan, our Associate Minister for Addictions and Mental Health. As you know, the government's had an ongoing review of the drug injection sites around the province, and we released that report that was developed by experts based on data, and decisions will be forthcoming about how to focus our efforts on treatment and services to people who are struggling with addiction. As you know, we've already invested tens of millions of dollars in creating thousands of additional treatment beds across the province, and we really think that's the best way to help people who are struggling with addictions to give them a way out of the destructive drug addictions that often ruin their lives. And in terms of this particular program, I'm not aware of that. So again, I'll refer you to AHS or Minister Lewan.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Next is Chris Varco with the Calgary Herald. Go ahead, Chris.
Hi, Premier. Just to follow up on Amanda's questions, right now, many of the oil and gas companies, the producers are going through their bank line, credit line redeterminations, and producers are continuing to say that they are not getting loans from either the EDC or BDC process that the federal government put in place. I guess I'm wondering now, what is the province going to do with its plans to help on the liquidity front? And can you be as specific as possible on what your timelines may be on any provincial assistance?
Sure. So, Chris, we are tracking this issue very closely. In fact, we spent a couple of hours at our one of our cabinet committees this week discussing liquidity and receiving a very detailed report from an outside consulting firm that we contracted to provide us with a clear picture of the liquidity needs of Alberta oil and gas companies. You're right to say that very few have been able to access the EDC, BDC instruments for mid-size companies that had been announced by Ottawa a few weeks ago, and there's also been very little take-up on the LEAF, the Large Employers Emergency Finance Facility. And so we have been working very closely with the Federal Department of Finance, with EDC, BDC, and with the major chartered banks to make those programs common sense and accessible for those who need them to ensure a future day for our largest industry. And I am pleased to say that there have been some recent changes. The federal government has expanded the criteria, relaxed the criteria, if you will, around the mid-size cap program. And I'm now hearing from industry groups and some oil and gas companies that they believe they can now access those programs. So we understand that there will be further changes coming from those two important Ottawa programs. So we continue to study our own potential response, but we want to, first of all, maximize access for energy companies to those federal credit facilities. And we expect further changes as early as next week. I have to confess, I've become impatient about this because of the gravity of this crisis for our largest Canadian industry sector and the implications for jobs in our broader economy. But I do want to acknowledge that the Government of Canada, the Department of Finance, have been responsive, better late than never, and I guess we'll see the perhaps final modifications to those programs next week before we decide what to do provincially.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Next is Janet French with CBC. Go ahead, Janet.
Hi there. Thanks for taking my question. I wanted to ask you about your response, or the response from Drew Barnes to the Fair Deal panel report. Obviously, he was on the panel, but he published this sort of dissenting opinion saying that he doesn't think it goes far enough. Like, what message do you have for Drew and other MLAs who share his views that Alberta should be more aggressive about pursuing or asking Albertans in general about separation?
Well, you're right. He was on the panel and had an opportunity, obviously, to share his views and incorporate them into the report. If you want to ask Mr. Barnes about his views, I encourage you to call him. I can't speak for him. I do believe that this demonstrates that our caucus, unlike the NDP government which preceded us, does allow for MLAs to raise their views and the concerns of their constituents, and that's an essential part of democratic discourse. I will say that I believe it's a solid report coming from the panel about ways to strengthen Alberta, to get more Alberta and less Ottawa, to maximize our leverage in the Federation to get a fair deal. And I fundamentally disagree with those who believe that we should make, I believe, empty threats about separation. I completely understand and sympathize with the profound frustration that so many Albertans have with the way that Canada has worked, particularly in recent years. I understand the frustration that has driven a not insignificant number of Albertans to talk about separation. But I fundamentally believe that that's the wrong path for Alberta. First of all, I am an unqualified Canadian patriot, and I don't believe you can qualify your patriotism. Either you love your country or you don't. And I love Canada, and I love it to the point where I want to improve it so that the Federation works as it was originally conceived at the time of Confederation. That means provinces exercising the powers that they are delegated under the Constitution, including the power to manage and develop and regulate their own resources, which the current federal government has been stepping on. So I would secondly make this point, that I don't believe, there's an argument, and perhaps this is what Drew is making, certainly others are, that threatening separation or threatening a potential referendum on separation will somehow strengthen our hand. Look, you don't make a threat that you're not prepared to keep. And I have not seen a single public opinion poll which indicates we're anywhere close to a majority of Albertans voting to leave Canada. And so I regard it as an empty threat. And I think making a threat like that would actually be counterproductive for those who advocate it. Thirdly, I would point out that the real crisis in this province is an economic crisis. It's a jobs crisis. And we're not going to get our economy growing again or get jobs back here if, first of all, we landlock ourselves with no potential access to the coasts for pipelines. And we're certainly not going to get investment to create jobs back in Alberta if we create a crisis of confidence by having a vote on separation. So I would say to folks who believe that's a clever tactic, let's keep our eye on the ball as Albertans. Everything we do has to be focused on getting our economy back, getting people back to work. Now, part of that is getting a fair deal in the Federation. Part of that is getting pipelines built and maximizing leverage to make sure it happens. Part of it is repealing anti-growth federal policies like the No More Pipelines law, the tanker ban. Part of it is getting a fair deal in terms of transfers with the fiscal stabilization program and equalization. All of those things connect back to the economic imperative in this province right now. But the answer to a campaign to landlock Alberta Energy is not for us voluntarily to landlock Alberta Energy by separating from this federation or by pulling ourselves out of the NAFTA free trade agreement with the United States. And if people think that this is some kind of a clever ploy, I would just invite them to look at what happened to the Quebec economy after the election of the Parti Québécois in 1976 on a threat to hold the 1980 sovereignty referendum. The dozens of major employers representing tens of thousands of jobs pulled out of Quebec. They went from Montreal mainly to Toronto. Real estate prices collapsed overnight, and hundreds of thousands of Quebecers left the province. So, no, I don't think this is a clever tactic. I think that's effectively, at a time when we've got to focus on economic growth, restoring investor confidence, and creating jobs, making that kind of threat that would destabilize investor confidence would be hugely counterproductive.
Okay, we have time for 3 more. Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Next is Adam McVicker with Global News. Go ahead, Adam.
Hi, Premier. Thanks for taking my question. There are a group of Alberta doctors this afternoon saying they're requesting the provincial government legislate mandatory non-medical masks when you're outside of the home. I was just wondering if I could get your stance on whether that's been discussed or if the government is looking at moving forward on that.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear part of that. Could you repeat the question?
Yes, absolutely. So there's a group of Alberta doctors getting together this afternoon, and they're requesting the Alberta government legislate mandatory non-medical masks for people when they're outside the home. Wondering if that's been discussed or if the government is looking to move forward on anything like that.
I just wanted to come, before I answer your question, Drew, I just wanted to come back to Janet French. One thing I should mention is that when the United Conservative Party was created through a grassroots vote of tens of thousands of Albertans in July of 2017, they endorsed the unity agreement, which said that the United Conservative Party was committed to a strong Alberta within a united Canada. So I would just remind people of that. That is the democratic mandate that I have and that the members of my party and government have. In terms of Drew's question, I appreciate that I haven't seen the actual submission from those doctors. I think they raise a very important question. I have been an advocate of using face coverings or masks in the pandemic since long before the Public Health Agency of Canada was recommending that. You may recall back in February and March, they were still telling people not to use these masks based on, I think, completely wrong-headed advice from the World Health Organization. I do note that in countries with the greatest success in combating the pandemic, like Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, that there is almost universal usage of masks in public areas, particularly in crowded contexts like mass transit. And I also would remind people that mask usage, I sometimes see on Facebook and elsewhere that people who wear masks because of the virus are somehow demonstrating that they're fearful or scared. No, this is not, actually the masks are not about protecting yourself, but protecting others. It's a sign of consideration or regard for your neighbors and your fellow citizens, because the science is now clear that it does limit transmission from asymptomatic individuals to others. It's not a perfect foolproof, and it does not replace all of the other common sense health measures that folks should take, including frequent hand washing and physical distancing. but it is a useful and effective complement to those basic health measures. And I guess I would put it this way to folks. If you want us to be able to continue with the most open economy in Canada, as we now have, and as we've had throughout the pandemic, if you want us to move forward to phase 3 of relaunch, if you want, in other words, to live more freely and more normally in this pandemic time, then mask usage in crowded areas where you cannot physically distance should be part of that. That is a small price to pay for both more freedom, more economic and social activity, and lowering the spread and saving lives. So I think that these doctors have a point about the importance of mask usage. I think it's deeply regrettable that the Public Health Agency of Canada and the World Health Organization were completely wrong about this at the beginning of the pandemic. Now, in terms of making this legislated, our view is, I agree with what Dr. Hinshaw has said from the beginning of the pandemic, that we're not going to enforce our way out of this. And we've thought long and hard about it, and I really don't want to end up in a situation where we have, police or bylaw officers ticketing people or arresting people for not wearing a face covering. I think that the implications of that are just deeply problematic. And so instead, what we've opted for is a very strong recommendation. Municipalities do have the right, and they may use it, and we'll see, to require mask use on mass transit, because once the economy fully gets going and we see crowded buses and LRTs, I just don't see how people can physically distance there. But that will be up to the municipalities. But as a province, our policy is strongly to encourage their use in places where folks cannot physically distance.
Okay, we have time for 2 more.
And if I'll just add to that, Drew, this is also why, we have done this widespread non-medical mask distribution program for Albertans, where we're distributing 40 million masks free of charge to Albertans. That was partly just to get folks used to the idea, to legitimize it, to make it a bit easier for them if they don't have access to those masks. So I guess our approach, instead of harsh enforcement, it's helpful, it's a helping hand. It's a positive rather than a negative approach.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Next is Vinesh Pratap with Global News Edmonton. Go ahead, Vinesh.
Hi, Premier. Thank you for your time today. Just related to today's announcement, it looks like it's geared more towards the smaller communities. FCM, they continue to advocate for help, $10 to $15 billion. Edmonton's portion, about $218 million. The Prime Minister has said the provinces need to step up. Is there any headway on that, or are we expecting an announcement on kind of support for the large cities?
The answer is yes and yes. You're right that today's announcement, these programs are primarily focused on smaller and rural communities. The STIP program has always been for critical infrastructure in rural areas like bridges, for example, that many small municipalities, these are parts of the provincial infrastructure. You can't get around the province without bridges, and yet, so they are an important part of the shared responsibility between municipalities and the province. But very often those smaller rural municipalities don't have the tax base to maintain or build bridges, for example, so it's a partnership program. In terms of the cities, yes, there will be additional announcements forthcoming, I think very soon, hopefully next week, about additional job-creating support for municipal infrastructure. And we are in ongoing conversations with both the two big cities, the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association and the Government of Canada in this regard. I would like to have moved earlier, but to be honest, part of the thing that we've been waiting for is clarity on what the federal government intends to do. Out of the $14 billion package that the Prime Minister has been talking about recently, we estimate, but don't know for sure, that about $2 billion of that may be earmarked for support for municipal governments, but we really don't have any clear picture of what the criteria are. So we may decide to go ahead ourselves, and we acknowledge that municipalities are under stress this year, as is every level of government and everyone in the private sector. But what we really want to focus on as our top priority is getting folks back to work, and that is something we believe infrastructure investments can do. While helping to improve our long-term competitiveness and productivity, they can also get people back to work this year with shovel-ready projects.
Okay, we have time for one more. Operator, can you please put through the last caller?
Final question is Sarah Comandino with Global News. Go ahead, Sarah.
Hi. I think this question is more for McIver, but I would like to specifically address Lamont County. They've been having a lot of issues with their rural road infrastructure flooding in the past this past month with a significant amount of rain. That rain has also been around for a few months, but they've been seeing a lot of problems. They're also saying that blocked culverts could be causing some of the flooding on farmers' fields, which is also creating more problems. And I'm just wondering if you can answer that question. What the province can do to help.
Well, this is an annual situation with the spring runoff, and of course the culverts are under roads to make sure that the water can flow through and get to go downhill as water wants to do. And of course in the spring, when the melting happens and lots of rain happens, there's lots of times that's when you learn that the culvert has failed. Or collapsed inside, or when you find that wood and other debris floats in and blocks the entrance to the culvert, which doesn't allow the water to get out the other side. We deal with a number of these issues across primarily rural Alberta every spring and summer. And while I don't know all the details on Lamont County, I apologize for that, but I could tell you typically we work with the local municipality. If it happens to be a provincial road and a provincial culvert, then of course that's completely our job, and we dispatch people to get out and fix it. If it happens to be a municipal road and culvert, that's essentially the municipality's responsibility. But there are times when there's things we can do with them. It's it's not a one-size-fits-all. We communicate with them and we try to find a solution for all of these things. So I will. On the Lamont one, I apologize. I don't know all the details on that, but that's typically what happens. And there are occasions where perhaps it's near a crossroads where one of the roads is municipal and one's provincial, and in which case we get together with the municipality and try to saw that off in an equitable way and protect Albertans in all cases from that high water. So again, I apologize for not having all the details on the Lamont County situation you're talking about, but it's a fairly common thing that we deal with every spring and summer.
Okay, that's it. Have a great day.
Thank you.